Hi there, and welcome to this Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas. For those of you who are new to the podcast, let me just briefly explain what it is that we're up to here. 6 years ago, I started conducting research into the challenge that we face within the information security industry, which has been labelled, rightly or wrongly, the human factor. Over that 6-year period, I identified a wide range of disciplines which weren't traditionally disciplines or skill sets or experience that you saw within the information security industry. But based upon my research, there were great opportunities for us to improve the current way that we're approaching the challenge of raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an appropriate organisational culture where security was truly valued. Those disciplines I took away and identified a specialist who came from an academic or a practitioner background who I believe could provide insights to the community here at the Rethinking the Human Factor to help sort of nudge us along that path towards a more mature approach to the challenges that we face. Series 1 of the podcast is all about reaching out to those people and bringing them into the community and trying to create a debate or a discussion around the insights that they are bringing to us. I think the really important thing to get from all of these podcasts is that the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture are not unique to the information security industry. And really, we have an opportunity to engage with people outside of the security industry, often with very, very different skill sets and experiences, to bring them in-house and to focus them in a way to help us with the challenge of raising awareness of information security and influencing positive security behaviours, whilst understanding and incorporating the cultural context that people are making choices within. So without any further ado, let's get on with the next interview. So hi everybody, welcome to the latest episode in the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas. And as I promise every week, I am looking to bring to you something which I think is really, really interesting. Now, this lady is called Rachel Laws, and Rachel comes from a background which, I'll be completely honest with you about this, I'd never heard of the phrase semiotics. So this is as much about me sort of getting to grips with things as it is about trying to introduce you to a new specialist in a new area as far as information security professionals are concerned. And you know what? I've read her white papers. We had a conversation beforehand. And I was like, God, this really ties in with a lot of the work that I've been doing. And so I thought, we've got to ask Rachel to come on the show. And Rachel has agreed to come and share some insights with us. So, Rachel, great to have you on the show.
Bruce, thanks very much for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. I'm really, really looking forward to having this chat. I read the white papers, and as I was reading through the white papers and seeing the presentations, etc., I was like, how many notes do I need to make here? This is going to take forever. I'm
flattered that you read all the stuff I sent you.
It was really, really good. It's just, you can get given a lot of stuff to do.
Yeah.
But if you find something that's really interesting,
I know.
And this is the thing that really blew me away is that, when I think about what you're saying, and then I was thinking about the interviews we've done with, the other guests on the show, and I go, that joins up with that. That joins up with that. And then you start to see things from a different angle. And that's the whole thing we're trying to do with the podcast is, rethink by getting people like yourselves in to sort of stir and create a different angle. So really chuffed that you could join us on the show. So do you want to just let us know a little bit about what semiotics is?
Yeah, I can do that. Yes. Okay. All right. So this is great for a kind of cocktail party type of conversations.
Okay. I'll get the drinks out. Hold on.
Yeah. So when people say, what is semiotics anyway, then the sort of correct answer you can give them is that it is the study of signs and symbols. Okay.
Okay.
So for anybody who's living in any sort of, environment that's been built up by human civilization in any way, so in other words, if you don't live in a cave or on a desert island, then you're surrounded by things that humans have produced. And, of course, in some parts of the world, like I'm speaking to you from London, and this whole city is full of signs and symbols, isn't it? So it's full of very specific pieces of architecture. It's also chock full of advertising. It's crowded with brands. People are walking around wearing fashions and particular hairstyles. Sometimes you can even detect what part of the city somebody is from, depending on what haircut they're wearing. So all of this stuff are signs and symbols, and semiotics is the study of that and what do those things mean. So that's the kind of easy version, and it's the version when people know anything at all about semiotics, that's what they know.
Right.
And then if you want to go slightly deeper into it, there's a kind of second half of semiotics that is less widely known about, which is that we're not just decoding signs and symbols as some kind of train spotting activity just because we like being geeky. We're doing it because the point of it is to reveal something about how society works. And that's of huge interest to people like brand owners, because they quickly realise, the first thing they realise is that they can use semiotics to sort of tweak their advertising and packaging and make people respond to it in the way that they want. And then not too long after that, they start to realise what it can really, really do at a deeper level. And they will start coming to me saying things like, we need to understand this particular demographic of consumers better, or they'll say things like, well, we've got this brand that sells really well in North America, but we can't shift it in Western Europe, and we think there might be something cultural going on. So that's essentially what semiotics involves, and that's what I do.
Okay, so it's a game of two halves.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Okay, I thought I'd just get a football pun in there. So the first, the first part of the pun, the first half of the game is really signs and symbols.
Yes, what do they mean? So if your brand logo is red or blue, what difference does that make, for example?
Yeah, and that's really important, the difference in colours, actually, and the impact that has upon the choices people make is a really interesting piece of research. People don't anticipate that it's going to have a big impact, but it does, and it does in different cultures, etc. So there's the symbols piece. And then the second half is really about understanding how society works to better inform the way that, for example, the example you gave was, to better inform how you tweak an advertising campaign or some sort of marketing campaign. Correct me if I'm wrong here, to better increase the likelihood that somebody's going to actually choose that brand over other brands. That's
exactly right. So, although I do some work in the public sector and in education, most of the work that I do is with consumer-facing brands, and this could be things like food, alcohol, retail banking, that type of thing,
right.
Pharmaceuticals in various different places.
Okay.
And what those brand owners have in common when they come to me is that they want to change behaviour. Okay, so then what they essentially want to do is they want people to start buying their brands. They want them to buy it in larger quantities. They want them to upgrade to the more premium version within their range. They want them to switch to their brand from somebody else's brand, that type of stuff. So essentially, it's all about behaviour change. And at first, initially, they come to me and say, can you help us develop new packaging or tweak our advertising so that it will influence people's behaviour more effectively? And then when they start to get a knack for semiotics, then they will come and say, we need to understand what's motivating this entire group of consumers. So I did a really interesting piece of work one time in the United States that was about the Hispanic population, who are relatively, especially men, are relatively reluctant to go and consult the doctor about health problems. And that means it's difficult to catch things like diabetes at an early stage. Okay. So you can use semiotics to answer those kind of big questions as well, like what is it exactly that Hispanic people don't like about going to the doctor, and how do we solve that? See what I mean? And that's quite a big question and goes a bit deeper than just what should we make our, what colours should we deck out our brand in, or what language should we use in our advertising?
Yeah, so it goes deeper, but it's almost like, I'm a big fan of marginal gains, and it's like you can tweak the colour, you can tweak the font, you can tweak, the content message to a certain degree as well, and then you start getting into the deeper stuff. There's all these really small improvements that, when you bring them all together, are like, this enables us to break through and to change that direction in terms of behaviour.
It's enormously powerful, so when I work with a brand owner over a period of time and they become more experienced and more skilled in doing this kind of work with me, once you've got that complete suite of routes to insight in your hands, that's an incredibly powerful position to be in. That's a really powerful and very desirable situation. And that is why semiotics has gone from being pretty unheard of 20 years ago when I first came on the scene to now something that is quite mainstream and quite well known in marketing circles, although it's still emerging. But, we're a long way forward from where we were 20 years ago.
Okay. So I'm now going to whirl us back to a comment you made, which I'm not sure if the listeners would have picked up upon, but I just picked it up like that. And I was like, that's really interesting. So you mentioned that how majority of your work is supporting organizations that are doing, business to consumer, got a product or a service to sell to consumers. But you did highlight there that you've got a relatively small number of clients who are more education, more government type base. And so what I wanted sort of, because this is a challenge many people sort of put my way, is they turn around and go, well, does business to consumer, do the insights we apply to the business to consumer situation, are they also, are they applicable when you're looking at, it's not a consumer, but for example, it's about trying to affect policy. Yeah. And that policy could be like at a government level, policy across the whole of our country. It could be policy in the sense of, organizational policy. Here we go. It's a policy, much like you have a national policy. Do you know what? We want people to comply with that policy. So I'm just trying to think, do you think there is because you drew a line, do you think those insights can be applied to both sides of the fence, so to speak, both external market and internal market?
Yeah, definitely, because it's about behaviour change, isn't it? It's about, as you say, you want people to comply, and that's the common thread that runs through all of the work that I do. So I could think of a couple of examples that are perhaps a bit closer to the industry that your listeners are in. Yeah, okay. So, for example, I did a bunch of work for Ofgem, which regulates the behaviour of energy suppliers. Okay. And as a matter of fact, they published a review that I wrote, which is available on the internet. So if people wanted to Google me and Ofgem, they'll be able to find that review. Okay. So essentially, the problem that Ofgem were having was that first of all, there are a lot of utility suppliers in the UK, all right? And there is no standardised practice amongst these suppliers about what kinds of words and phrases they use when they're describing their products and services and charging you for them. Right. Okay. Now, there are laws in place that stipulate that energy suppliers must do certain things. When they send you bills and statements, they're legally obliged to do certain things, like inform the customer that it's their right to change supplier and how to do that and who you should get in touch with if you've got a complaint. And they're also obliged to provide some sort of a cost breakdown so that you can see what you're spending. And so the situation was that all these proliferation of energy suppliers were complying with the letter of the law, but not really the spirit. So the information was all there, but it was quite a lot of it was in small print and tucked away in sort of at the end of the back page and that kind of stuff. But even more interestingly, there was an element of legalese, and there was quite an interesting demonstration of how you can put up a wall between you and your customer using language. So it was some of the language was needlessly formal and a bit middle class, and how shall I put it? Just a bit excessively technical and distant and a bit cold, and not very similar to how people actually talk when they're talking about household bills. And so, if you want people to fail to realise that they're entitled to change their supplier, and you want them to not quite understand what they should do if they've got a complaint, that would be a terrific way of going about it. So what I did was I conducted a detailed survey of energy bills and statements from a huge number of suppliers in the UK, and we looked at what some of these common practices were and then how to resolve them, and Ofgem found that really useful. And because it's a thing that can work both ways. If you can identify how to sort of keep people at bay and prevent them from understanding what's going on using language, then the flip side of that coin is that you've also got some things in place that will help make it much easier. And this was similar to a kind of another project that I worked on, which was it was private sector, but it was a catalogue company who wanted to alter the way that their local agents handled their sales paperwork. Right. So there'd been a change in the law, and this company needed their local agents, who are kind of just like local people on the ground in communities, taking orders for things like jumpers and shoes and things like that. often they've been doing it for years and they're very efficient at it.
Yeah.
The law changed and those people needed to start processing their information in a different way and according to a different time frame. Okay. So the catalogue company needed to get that information out to them. Now, the local agents, are brilliant agents, but they're not always very fond of reading, boring technical letters from head office, you know what I mean? So the catalogue company had a interesting problem on its hands. So they first of all we needed to get people to open the envelope in the first place. Yeah. Then we needed them to understand what was required of them and how much time they'd got. And thirdly, we needed them to comply. And this was I used kind of similar principles on this project as I did for Ofgem, in the sense that I set out some kind of well-established, well-researched rules for language use. Yeah. That just said, this is how you get closer to your person on the ground. If you speak to them like this, following these types of principles, then they will understand what you're saying, and you've got a much better chance of them feeling like you're in this together and they actually want to comply. Yeah.
So it's an element of tone of voice, isn't it, really?
Yeah, the tone of voice is a huge part of it. Yeah, and there are all sorts of interesting kind of linguistic details, like when I say that the energy suppliers were using a lot of quite sort of middle-class and remote language. What I mean by that is that one common thing that middle-class people really do a lot of is they speak in sentences that have a lot of clauses, like you and I are doing right now. and those clauses are often connected with words that imply a causal relationship. Yeah. So they'll say things like therefore to connect two clauses together. You see what I mean? Yeah. Whereas in more colloquial, everyday English, sentences are often shorter and clauses are more likely to be joined together with words that simply connect, words like and, as opposed to therefore. Do you see what I mean?
I get that, because I was having a conversation with somebody and I actually sometimes start my sentences with and.
Right.
When I'm writing them out. Yes. And some people go, you write as you speak sometimes. And I said, yeah, I know. I said, but the funny thing is, my teacher taught me never to start my sentences with and. But actually, when I'm writing, it seems natural to say and this. So, okay.
Do you know what I think is fascinating is that one consequence of digital culture, by which I mean not just the invention and penetration of the internet, but also the fact that, people are on their mobile phones and on social media all the time and things like that, is that written language has taken on a life of its own in a way that we haven't really seen for a long time, not within our lifetimes. This is new, relatively new. Yeah. And so written language now, if you think about the way that you communicate in writing, as you say, written language is no longer required to really follow the rules of grammar that you and I were taught at school. What's much more important is being able to get your message across, right? Absolutely. And so this might involve substantial use of abbreviations, emojis. It's no longer, how if you receive a text message and there are capital letters and full stops in there, you can kind of guess the age of the person who sent it to you.
It's true. It's very true.
So I think written language, because people are more involved with written language than they have been historically for a long time. You know what I mean? We don't write by hand anymore, but people communicate using language and text now more than they have done for a long, long time. And I think that as a result of that, written language has taken on a real life of its own and is operating according to its own rules. And that as well is something that organisations might want to take an interest in. Yeah. If part of their job is getting people to change their behaviour using written messages.
Really, really, really good point. In previous interviews with guests on the show, one of the key things to come across is that the challenge of, here are the corporate guidelines.
Okay. God. Yeah, right. Yeah. You already don't want to read, right? I mean, you're already kind of like, oh, God, do I have to read this?
Yeah. But in a way, it tells you what you don't want to be doing. It's like, oh, that's what we don't want to be doing then. Okay, fine. At least we've got a sense of real direction. But it is that thing about... And I understand why people feel the need for corporate guidelines. And there is some value in corporate guidelines. But it's about also recognising, hold on here... I really want to engage with my audience. I really want them to open up.
What do you want? Do you want to change people's behaviour? Because there is an element of meeting people halfway or even all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point you're making about there used to be a time where if you wanted to write anything down, you had to get your hands on a pen for a start and then find something. Right. And now you're like, no, I just do it on my phone. I communicate with anybody on my phone. So you communicate. People are communicating all the time, and especially certain demographics, it's a lot more all the time. And then they use a different language to in terms of when they're using those devices to what they might do when they're actually writing or even talking.
Do you mind if I ask you something, Bruce? Yeah. When you're typing a text message on your phone, how do you do it? Are you using two thumbs or a finger, or what are you doing?
Whatever's free at the time. I just tried it. Hold on. Yeah, I try using my thumbs, but it's not unusual for me just to use one finger because I hold the phone with one hand. I had the other, finger for doing things. If I hold it with two, sometimes it just seems a weird thing to do. Okay. Why are you? You're going to give us some insight.
Why am I asking? Yeah. Because it's as much as all this business about linguistics is interesting. How you physically manipulate your phone is also a semiotic sign. Okay.
Wow.
So if imagine that you're sitting on a train on the London Underground, for example, and you've got your phone out and you want to type a message to your friends, if you can do this adeptly using two thumbs, then you've signalled yourself to other people on the train as I'm essentially young and I've got the skills for coping with modern life. I've got the necessary repertoire of skills for being a competent, Londoner in 2018.
Yeah.
If you poke at your phone with one finger, which I'm also guilty of doing myself, I saw Donald Trump being mocked just the other day for doing exactly that. That somebody, of course, on camera stabbing at his phone with one finger trying to send a message, and he was widely kind of mocked, and it was like, look, this just proves how old and out of touch he is, So, like, the way that you use your phone is not a neutral thing, and especially if you just be careful, if you're doing it in public.
Yeah, everyone's looking at that guy over there. Yeah. He acts as old as he looks.
That's right, yeah, exactly. No one's going to believe that you're young and hip and trendy if you're poking at your phone with one finger like you've never seen a phone before, So maybe want to practice at home, Bruce, when no one's looking.
Well, nobody's looking.
Practice with your thumbs until you get good at it,
as the host of the show, I think we'll move on from my age. Anyway. So let's move on swiftly to. Okay, so that was interesting. The off-gen example was interesting. It's interesting how in that case they were like, yes, we are compliant with the legislation.
Yeah.
But you're right. The principle behind it was to bring around changes in behaviour. I think in that case it was to give people so they knew the options, which basically gave them a better chance of choosing between them, which is interesting because we did the interview with Dan Arley and he's behavioural economics and he's very much about choice architecture, designing the choices, and so Ofgem in a way were sort of going through that process. They were sort of eroding choice by wrapping it in language and symbols, which actually mystified people so that they didn't actually know.
It's so interesting. There are so many ways to make a message clear and so many ways to kind of obscure it and cover it up, One of the things that I noticed, so as I said, one of the things that there's about these utility suppliers is they're obliged to tell the customer about things like how to complain or, about their rights concerning leaving their supplier and switching to somebody else. And some of these energy suppliers were they were on the whole avoided using the word rights, and they preferred to use terms like advice. You can get advice from these organisations. You can talk to us, or you can talk to an ombudsman. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But they would favour the word advice over rights, and there's a good reason for that. Okay, because they're semiotically they're two completely different words. They might be close enough in meaning to kind of satisfy a lawyer, but if you look at it linguistically, they're two completely different things. So as soon as you use the word rights with a member of the public, they'll immediately go on alert. They're like, oh, this sounds important. I know my rights.
I
will not be swindled out of my rights. And it immediately registers as something important, and as rights are something that should be defended as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but advice. What's advice? You know what I mean? Oh, I didn't know what to do about my mother-in-law, so I wrote to the agony aunt at the Sun, and she gave me some advice, right? So, semiotically, advice is something which might or might not be correct. It might or might not be worth having. It might or might not be an expert who's giving it to you. You might or might not actually need it. It's a whole world away from rights. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So when you've got that little bit on the end of your energy bill telling you, blah, 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 you can get advice here. What they're really telling you is this: you've got to lose certain legal rights in the area of leaving your energy supply, but we don't really want you to know that. So there you go.
Yeah, that makes a lot. The concept of advice. I didn't ask for the advice. Okay, right. I'm already turned off.
Right, exactly. We have the idea of there's such a thing as unwanted advice, isn't there? You're quite right. Is there such a thing as unwanted rights? No, there isn't.
No, that's right.
Rights are by definition things that people want.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, I've just pinged out that I've been completely framed and triggered there. Okay, right. All right. So this is a situation though, because the work that you do and semiotics is about is partly, going back to the opening part of our chat, is sort of seeing what's going on in a given audience and trying to understand what are the signs that what is it they're giving off? What are the signs that you see in the audience, which may be a reflection on how they would respond to you presenting something to them, isn't it? Yeah. Do you want to just flesh it out a little bit in the sense of, okay, signs, you mentioned brands, you've given the example of how somebody uses the phone. I'm really interested in the cultural piece as well. You use the examples of South America and their reluctance of men in particular to go and speak to dogs. Could you just explain that a little bit more? And especially the cultural context, the fact that if I was trying to sell a product across a range of different countries, okay, how does semiotics help you engage more effectively and influence choices more effectively?
Yeah, okay. This is quite a common question that people ask me. And so one of the common concerns of brand owners is that they might be operating in multiple countries. And so their question is, how can we develop a brand or brand communications which are going to be effective all over the world? And of course, that's quite a tall order because there's a lot of cultural variation around the world. However, the good news, if we want to call it that, is that globalization is a thing, okay? And so for any community that can afford to participate in consumer culture, what I mean by that is people have got some disposable income. And that makes them interesting to brand owners. So anybody who can afford to spend on lifestyle stuff is to some extent part of a kind of global community of consumers. And so there are certain rules which apply pretty much everywhere. Like, for example, the colour red has a lot of meanings with some variation around the world. But within its repertoire of meanings, one that doesn't really change is the idea that it communicates being the first or the original or the best or the primary example of something.
Okay.
Which is why it's a good choice for Coca-Cola. It's also why, as a matter of fact, if you look at the, I don't know if you ever look at things like lists of most successful companies that are published from time to time. If you look at their logos and their brand marks, the most common colours are red, blue, and black. You're not going to see a lot of yellow, purple, green. You're just not going to. Red, blue and black dominate the scene, okay? So there are some meanings of colours, like this business back red signifying things which are first or primary or the original, the important one, the biggest one, the first one on the list. That's pretty much universal. There are also, like, for example, gold communicates, obviously kind of wealth and luxury, and this too is almost universal. So that's the good news for kind of global messaging. The bad news is, I guess, because of its global reach, it is not very nuanced. It's not going to make anybody feel special. No one's going to look at this thing and think, oh, they've specially designed it for me, which is why Coca-Cola needed to release that range recently. Have you seen those bottles, Coke bottles with people's names on?
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, really nice. So they needed to do that because Coke is almost a victim of its own success. It's kind of so globally recognised that it's almost a bit, starts to lose its meaning because it's a bit generic. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the global situation. And then more specifically, sometimes at the other end of the scale of specificity, you've sometimes got very particular consumer groups or very particular regions of the world who are doing something interesting or presenting some kind of interesting problem for business. And then you can use semiotics to find out how to address them. So I was just earlier today in a meeting where I was talking about British men, young British men, and how the rules for being a British man have really changed dramatically over the last several years, especially with regard to the way that they're expected to look. So, you know, when I was growing up, you know, British men had a kind of diplomatic immunity from having to care about their appearance. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
You could have scruffy hair, and you know, you were expected to put on loads of weight after you got married and have bad teeth, and it was part of being British. It was one of the benefits of being British, you know, that you didn't have to bother about this stuff. But then more recently, you know, I saw this shocking statistic which said that rates of young British men being hospitalised with eating disorders had gone up 70% in 6 years. And there's a reason for that, because now young British guys are subject. There's been a social change in this country, and there are standards and sort of ideals in place that say what you're supposed to look like if you're a young guy, you know, and you're supposed to have this outrageous kind of musculature that is just not achievable without being in the gym all the time. You need to have a tan, even though we don't get much sunshine. You must get Maori tattoos all down one arm to kind of show off your impressive muscle shape. Yep. You know, you've got to have exactly the right haircut, and you've got to submit to this quite difficult regime. And your performance will be continuously monitored because you've got to constantly take selfies for your Instagram accounts. You know, you'll go on a kind of lads holiday once a year to Ibiza or whatever, and you'll be photographed by everybody there. So British men are very much on display now in a way that they haven't been historically, and are really feeling the pinch. And so I was chatting with a client this morning about that, and about how, because they're interested in how they can target young British guys and get them to switch to a different alcohol brand. Right. And so, you know, we were discussing how in order to get them to switch to a different brand, you've really got to understand what kind of cultural influence is there. Yeah. Being exposed to, because they've changed, you know, they're not what they used to be. And it's the situation here in the UK is somewhat specific to the UK and would be found in different, you know, kind of degrees or amounts in other countries. So
that's interesting. That's interesting. You know, the culture, the standards which are driving the change that you were talking about, that they've been prevalent for women for a long time.
Forever.
You know, forever.
So long, and it's not that much fun, I have to say, constantly being sort of, you know, because spending your whole life being shown pictures of bikini models and told that's what you're supposed to look like, when realistically there's no hope of it ever happening. Yeah. But having said that, I think women have had such a long history of that we've developed a lot of coping mechanisms, okay? Like, we're quite good at supporting each other and, you know, kind of agreeing amongst ourselves that this is just a hopeless fantasy. Whereas men, I think, don't have that those historical coping methods are just not there. And that's why we've seen this sudden spike of men being hospitalised, you know, because they've got all these impossible standards that are expected to live up to, and the coping mechanisms are not yet in place.
I think it's, you know, think about things from a cultural perspective. It's quite interesting. It's you know, when you look at culture, I mean, we were lucky to have Gert-Jan Hofstede on, and he's coming back. And so we've talked about culture to him with a certain degree. Yeah, and we've got a couple of other people lined up. And it seems when you start to really look at culture, you understand how, you know, people tend to look at culture as like almost like an afterthought, but actually it's there. I mean, culture forms everybody.
There's no escape from it, you know. Have you been to the Andreas Gursky exhibition that's on at the Hayward Gallery on the South Bank at the moment?
No, I haven't, no.
Okay, so listeners, if you haven't seen the Gursky exhibition, go and see it because it's amazing. Okay. So Gursky, as we all know, is a German photographer, and he is famous for these huge photographs, like really large-scale photographs, that are cleverly taken so that there's nothing which is out of focus. So he'll take these enormous kind of landscapes, or he's taken some really impressive photos of things like the stock exchange in Chicago, kind of big top-down views of huge hordes of people doing their thing, you know. And so that's his thing. He takes these gigantic photographs where you can see every detail, okay.
Yeah.
One of his most famous photographs, which is on exhibition in London right now, if people can get to see it, is called 99 Cent. Okay. And it was taken in essentially a pound shop, a dollar store.
Okay.
And the photograph is taken from the point of view of a security camera. So you feel like you're up on the ceiling, looking down on this brightly lit store, watching people doing their shopping. Okay. And what we can see is that it's quite a striking photo for a number of reasons, partly because you wouldn't normally view a supermarket from that angle. Okay. Yeah. What we notice are certain things. Principally, I think the principal kind of, for me, the principal takeout of that photo is that there is no, apparently there's no escape from the supermarket. There's no visible exit. The aisles go on forever and have no end. There are no windows. There's no natural daylight. It's a completely self-contained seals environment, quite a large one. And we're looking down upon all those rows of product, brightly coloured, gaily wrapped, highly processed food. And you can see a few people dotted about in the aisles, thoughtfully exercising their right to choose and their free will. Okay, and they're standing there in these aisles almost like rats in a maze. Yeah. And they're pondering, which one shall I get, you know, of this kind of, between those two packets of highly processed, brightly coloured chemical goo, shall I get the red one or the blue one? Yeah. And it's almost the epitome of the kind of illusion of choice on the part of the consumer. So if you went up and asked them in a typical market research fashion and said, "What are you doing?" They go, "Oh, well, I'm deciding if I want blueberry or strawberry," you know. And the illusion of free will and choice is there. And what they can't see and what we can see, thanks to Gursky taking this photograph from this vantage point of the ceiling, is that this choice is illusory and that they're not free to choose something more consequential like getting out. There is no escape from the supermarket. That's essentially his message, I think. And so I think culture is like that. These people, although they don't know it and have no reason to contemplate the matter, are surrounded by semiotic signs and symbols, and there's no way to get out of it. There's nowhere you can go on this earth anymore. Maybe some remote parts of Antarctica or somewhere, but essentially there are not many places left on the planet that you can go to escape the supermarket. We're surrounded by culture and the products of culture all the time.
That's really interesting. It's really beautifully put. I mean, when you're describing that, you know, people are, you know, the supermarket, it locks off the outside world to a certain degree. It creates an environment within which people operate, shop, and it basically designs the environment in a way that it presents options to you. So the concept of freedom of choice. Yeah. Now, whether that's in the supermarket or anywhere outside, I think to a certain degree, you know, there's definite argument about this, is that there is no freedom of choice. There is only choice between options which are presented to you.
That's right, exactly. So this is where behavioural economics becomes important, right? Because you can pretty much control whether people will pick the red one or the blue one, right? And you can do clever things with pricing and stuff like that. Yeah. So I think semiotics has a lot in common with behavioural economics in that regard. Yeah. I think what semiotics will additionally do that behavioural economics doesn't include within its remit is that it will offer this kind of vantage point from the ceiling. Yeah. Where we observe that there's actually no escape from the supermarket. And I would even add, you know, next time you're in a supermarket and you're kind of feeling conscious of that, when you step outside, you still haven't escaped. You know, you step outside of that supermarket into something else, into some other cultural product like London or Surrey, where I was a bit earlier, or wherever it may be. And when you go to work, let's say you've been in the supermarket on your lunch break and you walk down the street in London and return to your office and go back to work, that workplace too is a product and a manifestation of culture. So organisational culture is something people talk about a lot, isn't it? And sometimes it's a bit nebulous and we wonder what it means. But for me as a semiologist, culture is manifest in a very extremely tangible way. It's things you can actually point at, you know. It's what the floor looks like, and how the place is decorated, and what sort of chairs people are sitting on, and what's the common consensus around what you do after at lunchtime and after work, and what people are wearing, and whether or not people shout and raise their voices, all of that type of stuff. It's, for me, culture is something very tangible, and you can easily point at it, and it's very empirical.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I always sort of stipulate the difference between, there's a tangible side to culture and there's the intangible side. And, things like somebody comes back from doing the shopping at lunchtime and they've got a bag, they've been given a bag, and I don't know, it's got the name of the retail outlet they've been to. And that just acts as a trigger for you, especially if they come back and they brought the lunch back and you're not really sure about what you're going to have for lunch. Somebody who comes into the office with bag with company X on it, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, and it just it acts as a trigger. And these organizations specifically do those bags because they want to trigger in other people.
Yeah, that's right.
It's about raising awareness about the brand, but it's actually about triggering people that have enjoyed the experience of buying their product, their lunch from that particular company. And it's just a trigger to remind them, oh, it's 12 o'clock, somebody's could just come back in the office with their lunch. Oh yeah, that's right, I'll go to company X.
But also, like, entire, organisational cultures will spring up around things like approval or disapproval of different products. So I was chatting with a consumer just recently, and she is a social worker, and she's, in many respects, what you would think a social worker would be like. She's a jolly nice lady, and she wears sort of cardigans and cares about young offenders and all that good stuff. But she, for whatever reason, she loves Apple. And she's got the latest iPhone, which is a significant wedge of cash, and she just loves the brand, and she's really pleased with her toy, But when she pulls it out at work just to endure a certain amount of mockery and disapproval from her colleagues, because the kind of local culture of her office suggests that, what they're saying to her is, oh, you're just being a mug, aren't you? You do realise that you're just paying over the odds. You could, if you must have a fancy smartphone, you could have a Samsung for half the price and it'd be a better phone, People who like Apple are just sheep, and you see what I mean? So in the culture of her workplace, there's this attitude that, well, we've got a bit more insight than other people, and we shouldn't be susceptible to handing over huge sums of money for flashy brands that are all kind of all form and no content. They're all, all style and no substance. Yeah. So she for her, she's doing it. She's just trying to enjoy her phone. Presumably, it's up to her what brand of phone she has. But an organisational culture is manifesting itself in the quite strong reactions that she'll get from her workmates, and I think that's happening in workplaces all over the country with regard to everything. Yeah. What you eat, who you socialise with, all of that stuff. Yeah.
So on the point of symbols, I mean, my work around culture, symbols play a significant part in the makeup of any given culture. When you think of symbols, are these just logos, like a brand identity? I make it clear, identity, because that's one of the things we're really hot on this podcast is brand is not just the logo. Brand is a lot more than just the logo. So is semiotics about the logo, or is it, when you think about imagery, is it more than a logo?
Yeah. So I think that when people first encounter semiotics, the first thing they learn about is this business about decoding signs and symbols, and you can pass on those skills relatively quickly, and people think, oh, this is great, I can detect I can see how red and blue are different. I understand why Coca-Cola is red. I understand why airline seats are nearly always blue. They can do that. They can pick up things like when you should use a serif or a sans serif font without much difficulty. But really, if you stop there, all you're doing is train spotting. Right? All you're doing really is just collecting signs and symbols and noting them down in your little notebook. You know what I mean? Yeah. So if you really want to get the most out of semiotics, we then need to connect it to something, and we need to ask not only what does this semiotic sign mean, but what does that tell us about the culture that produced it. I'm in my spare time, I'm learning Mandarin.
Okay.
Because I like to give myself a challenge. I heard it takes about, if you want to become a fluent reader, it can take a Westerner about 10 years. And I thought, that'll give me some of these for 10 years. It's like this early stage of learning Mandarin, which is very fascinating to me because I'm in semiotics, and so all of those Chinese characters are signs and symbols, right?
Of course.
So on the one hand, I'm actually learning to read quite fast because I spend all day looking at signs and symbols, and so the characters are very appealing to me and make a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
And so that's the kind of bottom-up stuff that everybody knows about semiotics. It's like when you look at the Chinese character for tree and go, oh, look at that, it looks like a tree, which it does.
Yeah.
Which is great. That's the easy part, right? But then at the same time as I'm studying this language, I'm also learning about something about Chinese culture, which is the more interesting top-down part of semiotics, the more difficult part. Like, did you know there's a word in Chinese which specifically means being rude and insulting to elderly people?
Okay.
Isn't that fabulous?
Isn't
that fabulous? Like in English, we've got lots of words for being rude to somebody, but we don't have a word for specifically being rude to the elderly. There's just something about that just I find that deeply satisfying, and it's the Chinese language is full of that. And indeed, I just use it as an example because for most of us who are listening to this podcast are English speakers.
Yeah.
And so Chinese is so removed from English that it serves as a useful example. But if you can see how the Chinese characters reveal something about not just the mechanics of how language works, but also about the culture that produced that language, then you can see how exactly the same is true of English and the same is true of any other language in the world.
That's really, really pretty put. Culture and my work, language is one of the is one of the cornerstones, and which is why it surprises me that so many organizations will insist upon communicating in, let's say, the official business language for this organization is English. So all our comms are in English, and you've already stripped out one of the key cornerstones of any given, not just nation. I mean, obviously, lots of, there'll be Chinese speakers all around the world, that there'll be, English is spoken outside of England. So you strip that out straight away, and you're right. The language is a reflection of values, and the thing with China, the respect for the elders in society is
exactly.
Confucius thing going on there, isn't it? It's just the same with Japan, etc.
Exactly. So if for us, sitting here in the UK having this conversation, we can sit here and go, isn't that fascinating? That in China there's a word that specifically means being insulting to elderly people. Well, you could imagine this conversation taking place in China with one person saying to another, did you know in English there's no word for that?
Yeah.
They just don't have it. It doesn't exist as a concept. Like and I really think that says something about us, that we don't value elderly people or senior people as they might think of it, or people who've achieved some kind of level of wisdom or experience. We don't value that very much, and we just feel free to talk down to people of any level of wisdom and experience in the same way that you might talk down to the kid who sits at the next desk or whatever.
Or is it it was interesting when I spoke with Gert-Jan Hofstede, or is it a reflection on we just have different values?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's about. And so if you want to change people's behaviour, you need to know what those values are, and you need to know how to activate them. And that's what semiotics is good for. It will give you all kinds of not only insight into what's motivating your target person, but also it will give you some very practical tools for how to address that person and how to create physical environments and things like that which cause them to behave in the way that you want.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a perfect opportunity for us to bring this chat to, and I think we could talk for a lot longer, and I suspect that it would be great to have you back on the show and to build upon that, because that's really, again, it's another chat with somebody that just joins more of those points together. You're almost like talking about, you tick here, tick here, tick here, tick here. But actually, I think the real art to raising awareness and importantly influencing behaviour is about understanding. You can understand all these bits, pieces, like tactical solutions, like you were talking there about why blue over red, all those type of things. But actually, it's for me, I always ask the 5 whys, the why, and eventually I get to that point where I go that now I'm pretty much I understand the principles, and that enables you to answer any question. And I think another conversation with you would flesh that out even more. But I think it's been really interesting. And
good.
how it just went off. Sorry, like you think about brand, but then playing to one of my favourite subject matters, which is culture, was absolutely awesome.
I know, and it will. Just a warning, listeners, if you're going to get into semiotics, it will take over your life. Nothing will go untouched. You start out thinking, well, this will be an interesting technique I can use at work. No. No. Once you've developed that skill set, something will switch in your brain and it will never switch off.
You might start learning Mandarin for a start.
Yeah. Everything around you and everything in your life will suddenly start showing up on your semiotic radar. Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll come home one day and look at the way that you've decorated your home and go, okay, I've just realised what this says about me.
What it says about you. Yeah, could be. Yeah. But that's great. That's the sign of learning new stuff. Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, Rachel. And what we will do in the meeting notes, we'll put a link to the site, and also we'll highlight some of the suggestions that you've made in terms of other places to go and have a look at information, so the listeners can go there and have a change of career. And look, I'd love to have you back on the show at some point once everybody's had enough time to let this all think through. And so without any further ado, look, I'd really like to thank you on behalf of the community for taking the time out. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Bruce. That was great. Thanks very much indeed.
All right, Rach. Take care.
All right, cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers, bye.
Well, as I do with all the guests that we have on the show, I just absolutely having that chat with Rachel there. Absolutely electric. As she's talking through semiotics and the work that she does with clients and the origins of semiotics, it enables me to sort of join even more dots together across all the research I've done over the past 6 years. And, it's fascinating to see the similarities between the challenges that her clients face, who are generally business to consumer, smaller number of people, business to business, and then government, and the challenges that we as the information security community face day in, day out when it comes to awareness, behaviour and culture. So I really think there are insights there which can be transferred across, and I hope that you found that of interest too. If you found the episode interesting, please can I ask you to leave a review or a testimonial. You can either do that via iTunes, or you can do that on the LinkedIn group that we have for Marmalade Box, Rethinking the Human Factor. Or you could drop us an email, just that I can share that with the community, and especially with the team here who are behind the podcast, because everybody likes to know that the work is being appreciated. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please do let us know. Maybe even share it with people in your own network and communities to help spread the work that we're doing here. So how can you stay abreast of the latest podcasts that we're going to be publishing? Simple ways to do that: sign up to the RSS feed, sign up to the newsletter at www.marmaladebox.com, or alternatively, request to join our LinkedIn group, which is the Marmalade Box Rethinking the Human Factor LinkedIn group. So who do we have next on the show? The usual routine that we have here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast is to invite 3 or 4 guests on from outside the security industry. And then what we do is we ask one of our listeners to join us on the show and to share the insights that they've learned from the past 3 or 4 podcasts. And then we have a discussion around those 3 or 4 podcasts. Who will that guest be? Well, that's a little secret, but you will be finding out in the next 4 weeks. Do remember that if you do sign up to the Marmalade Box newsletter, you will have the opportunity to actually submit a question for me to pose to our hosts on the podcast, and to get them to answer that as best they possibly can. I hope that you found this latest podcast interesting. I know that I thoroughly enjoyed it as ever, and I really do hope that you can join us in the next 4 or 5 weeks to listen to our latest update and our latest insights around information security, awareness, behaviour and culture. Many thanks.